Hi, everyone. Today we're joined by Rehmke of economicthinking.org. He's been a longtime educator in the homeschool debate community and the public school debate community, and even the professional community. I've interacted with him on several of those levels, including attending his workshops back in 2002, 2003 trade year. So thank you for joining us, Greg. And we're here to kick off your thoughts on the Stoa team policy topic about China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan trade policy. What do you think?
Well, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate being able to participate. It's a great topic, biggest topic in the world, really. China's the biggest economy developing, and China is integrated now with Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and the U.S. They've become one sort of, well, not, you could say blob, but very tightly integrated. Look at Apple Computer. It is a Chinese company and a U.S. company, and anything that gets in the way of these trade agreements is going to be trouble. So it's worth students, digging into this and looking at it.
Interesting. So you mentioned Apple. Are there any other really large, like Fortune 500 companies that affect every supply and purchase that Americans make, so that we can help understand the impact of policy decisions here?
I'd be surprised if there were any Fortune 500 companies that were not, at least in manufacturing, but also in service, that weren't involved, with Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan in some big way. All our laptops, I think, come from Taiwan, but they're designed in different places. If you read laptops, cars, electronics, some of those parts go back and forth between countries 5 and 6 times. There might be a chip factory in Malaysia. From there, they're shipped here, programmed. They go to Japan. They go back and forth. So you've got an amazingly integrated international trade system that's developed over the last 20 years. And China sort of changed everything, not only because the inexpensive, low labor costs, but the incredible high productivity of Chinese workers.
That's fascinating, because I think, for us in an integrated age where we don't even think about manufacturing and supply chains anymore, digging into it is one of the biggest values, I think, of the topic this year, right?
Right.
So maybe we could go in order and kind of talk about this blob, and then maybe a couple, maybe each country at a time. Just kind of, what are the big themes that you see, especially from an economics perspective, for U.S. policy with each? So starting with the blob, what do you think are the most controversial themes right now?
Well, of course, we're right in the middle of the controversy over the trade agreement. What the U.S. has tried to do is set up a counterforce with China. And so this TPP, this current trade agreement, is to try to get the U.S. in a freer trade arrangement with countries around China, with the goal of preventing China from locking in these countries at the cost of the U.S. So, this kicks off with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which integrates the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. That leads to the European Union integration that integrates the, low-wage Eastern European countries with high-wage Western Europeans. And then in China, at the same time, you've got the countries with a lot of capital and expertise and high wages, which are Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan. They integrate with China. That is, they build factories in China, they invest, they set up research centers. So these trading blocs, European, NAFTA, China, there's a challenge that they could, set up trade barriers with each other. But the U.S. has tried to forestall that with China by setting up this Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Interesting. So I'm getting this mental image of one big blob over here that's the United States, and coming off of it are all these little connectors through NAFTA. And then over here there's China and all these little connectors that we're trying to build through TPP. Is that a fair assessment at all?
I think there's that. And also, though, that it's all integrated. So you look at the I think it's Gossen, who's the Brazilian-born French head of the Italian car company Fiat that bought the Japanese car company, I think Nissan. He's a comic book hero in Japan. He's on comic books that kids read. And so those parts are being produced in factories in China where they're selling. They're being produced in Italy, France, US, Brazil. So the car market, if you look at it, it's integrated. So these trade agreements, there's a lot going on, I guess I'd have to say. And so you look at different aspects of it. I just posted today on my Astounding Ideas blog about the energy side of it, because the U.S. restrictions on coal exports or gas exports, those are part of the current climate-oriented trade agreements with China, and that's where I think the action is. The integration, the background integration with the big guys, with the Apples and the car companies, is ongoing. So I think one side of somebody might accidentally throw a wrench in the works. Mm-hmm. President Bush is said to have referred to Taiwan as an independent country, almost or by accident. Well, that almost started a war. So, there's things that can go wrong because China's intensely nationalistic, as is Japan. Those are real danger points. But the corporate integration at the level of car companies and electronic companies is sort of ongoing and unstoppable.
So for the United States to navigate this policy environment, it sounds like we need to, on the one hand, realize that businesses are far ahead of policy in the sense that it's far more borderless, and policy creates artificial borders, but businesses have to get around them. And second of all, that there are drivers that other countries might have, such as nationalism, that we don't necessarily see through those eyes in the same way, and so we can kind of destroy a seemingly sound theoretical argument with something that plugs into the electrical socket of passion.
Yes, the trade wars may erupt in various unexpected ways. For example, the China stock market is this Shenzhen market and the Shanghai market. They're up 100%, over 100%. They're likely to crash in the next weeks or months in a huge way, by half, by 2/3. The U.S. market may collapse, in a like it did in 2008 and 9 because of, the financial over-leveraging and derivatives and various things. If that happens, what might happen is, trade restrictions. The Smoot-Hawley tariff came to the U.S., and the sense of the high unemployment and financial turmoil led people to lobby for trade restrictions. So those sorts of things could appear in times of financial turmoil. The Greek crisis going on today, the China market falling. What you want to make sure is the pressures that are pushing for trade restrictions for other reasons, environmentalists, manufacturers, union guys, that they don't sort of coalesce and, on the basis of fear, lead to dramatic trade barriers that would block this ongoing integration.
I see. So what I'm hearing from kind of a debate strategy perspective is, as you're thinking of squirrels, people doing little tiny cases that seem good, they may trip a largely fragile, broader ecosystem, even if the policy itself seems well guided.
That's my sense. And again, I should emphasize, this is the beginning of the debate season. So I know a lot about the subject in general, but even in the 5 or 6 years since I've dealt with this topic before, things have changed quite a bit. So I'm just starting with these. So if something sounds outlandish in my conversation, it's that we're exploring these ideas, and I've posted in more details. But David Stockman, who used to be Ronald Reagan's official in the Reagan administration, he has a post, and he's constantly expecting cataclysm because of financial over-leveraging. So you get these tipping points that might push us into disaster one way or the other. Those are things to be alert about. We hope for progress and things to get better, but things can go pretty dramatically wrong. For example, in the last election, candidate Romney, who's running for president, in one of the debates, he says, "My first act as president will be to label China a currency manipulator." And so he's our free market, free trade, sophisticated consultant running for president. But he was arguing that that China is manipulating its currency, pushing its currency down to make their goods look better on world markets. That may be true, but branding your number one trade partner a currency manipulator seems like a poor way to start an administration. So looking at currency issues, monetary policy, that's probably the biggest issue in terms of what could mess up the trade system.
That's fascinating. So the extent to which our own financial system allows its banks even to take risks and the reserve certain percentages versus the other countries even factors into the whole financial system that supports the trade environment.
Yeah, we have a strange system where everybody is on the quantitative easing bandwagon, right? The U.S., the Fed has shifted gears since 2008 and is increasing the money supply dramatically, but also restricting it in various ways. But we're doing that. Japan has just started doing that in a massive way, and that's a danger for its bond market, world bond markets, and then Europe is too. So maybe China is too, trying to stave off a financial collapse. So you've got every country trying to increase its currency and reduce the value of its currency, and that just adds a lot of uncertainty into the system.
This is fascinating. So to what extent does China's ownership of U.S. debt factor into the topic this year?
It's a big issue. First off, as a background, all the sort of China fear topics, like they own the debt or we rely on them for manufacturing, those are the same arguments used against Japan 20 years ago. You can take a dozen articles from 20 years ago and take out the word Japan and put in China. And the same thing today. So there's a tendency to fear the fact that they're foreigners and they could, leverage us because they own all this debt. The key, I think, is that China has an incredibly high savings rate, the Chinese people. So 30, 40, 50% savings rate. So these are people that are incredibly poor by our standards, and they're saving half or two-thirds or one-third of their money. And with that money, they're investing in housing and real estate. They're investing in the stock market there, and their savings rate allows their government to buy our debt. So one of the things the Chinese people through the Chinese government are doing are investing in the safest investment in the world, which is U.S. bonds, U.S. treasuries. So that's just one issue of that. So they have a high savings rate, so the country can invest in other countries, so they're investing in companies, buying real estate, and buying treasuries in the U.S. But worst case scenario, what are they going to do with it? I mean, Jeff Hummel and others believe that we will repudiate our debt at some point or inflate its value down. But in the end, they've loaned us money because they trust us. Mm-hmm. And with the interest rate so incredibly low, that's not as much as a burden as it might be. But if interest rates go up again, it will be an issue.
So we've talked a lot about China and really revolved around that. To what extent do you think U.S. trade policy should be thought of in terms of the individual countries, or do we always have to factor China and the group into play?
I think if you look at how China's developed, I remember I was in Beijing when we had a national debate topic on China policy years ago. I was at a conference that the Friedrich Naumann Foundation sponsored maybe 15 years ago. And all around Beijing are giant signs of South Korean companies, on the tops of buildings, on the walls. So, the huge South Korean chaebols invested in a huge way in China. The Taiwanese companies have invested in a huge way in Fujian province, where a lot of the Taiwanese came from at the end of the war. And so those countries are integrated. Japan, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan have invested massively in China. So all their products for the world, their flat screen TVs and the various things they produce, a significant part of those come out of factories in China. So it's, factories, technology, expertise, engineering from these countries that has gone into China beginning, 20, 30 years ago, Now, of course, the Chinese have a lot of their own powerful companies with their own investment in engineers. But so I guess my point is the countries are integrated in a major way. Mm-hmm. Disputes on islands between Japan and China, with the Spratly Islands, those are significant issues. Nationalistic issues between Japan and Japan, the current president or prime minister is extremely nationalistic. He's part of a weird nationalistic group that is trying to rewrite what they teach in schools. Wow. To put Japan as the right side, and that's going to drive China crazy. The businesses in Japan are the stable force because they know if their government gets nationalistic, Chinese customers won't buy their products. And there have been riots against Japanese companies in China over various issues. So those are flashpoints that we want to be cautious about and make sure we don't accidentally, poke somebody in the eye and cause this big storm.
Right. I think I remember also that 100 years ago, Japan occupied what is North and South Korea in an incredibly brutal and kind of terrible domination. And South Korea still remembers gaining its freedom, much more recently than the United States does. And there are huge issues there, such as calling the Sea of Japan or the East Sea or whatever, right?
Right. And reparations for the Korean women that were forced into prostitution to Japanese soldiers. The Japanese were also in Manchuria. And students should step back a bit and look at this history. Look at the open door policy. When you look that up, you find a little bit about Deng Xiaoping opening up China to international investment. But you also find the earlier open door policy, which is the U.S. government pushing into China and arguing that the colonial powers, Germany, England, France, America, and Japan, that were all in China, that China open up investment. So it's that phase that is seen by the Chinese as foreign powers hurting them and so forth. So just a few bits of this. So the U.S. steps in and is involved there, and then U.S. opposes Japanese in Manchuria. The Spanish-American War, we take over the Philippines. The Philippines is a major supplier of raw materials to Japan. We block those exports because we're trying to force Japan to pull out of Manchuria and change its policies in China. Japan responds by bombing Pearl Harbor. So this turmoil is part of U.S.-China policy. Japan argued it was just trying to clear out the colonial powers, the British, the Americans, the others that had imposed themselves in China because of superior technology. Japan claimed they were clearing out colonialism. And of course, they did that, but also they brought something worse, which was their colonial policies. So this student should understand this history. These are relevant things. Also, why does China react so violently to Christianity or skeptically of Christianity? Well, you don't have to look too far in history to see the turmoil in China caused when a Christian claimed he was the prophet and started a whole revolution, and you can look into that. So these are sorts of background history stories for students, and I know I've jumped all over the place to look at the topic.
This has been a great overview, starting overview of the topic. Much appreciated. I've heard issues of, we've got to think about pharmaceuticals, many of which the devices or, the chemicals or whatever, there's going to be manufacturing in China and vice versa, about energy, about computing, the computers we're talking on right now. And huge issues, nationalism, financial leverage, quantitative easing, taxes, value-added taxes, the role of multinational corporations. This is absolutely huge, and I'm sure an economist's dream. We'll be bringing you, if anybody wants to come hear more of Greg, we'll have more of these interviews for sure, but he's also coming to Patrick Henry College debate camp in mid-July, and you should think about coming there. Greg, any final words for the students as they get started diving into this topic?
Well, here's the thought. 50 years ago, the countries that we're now looking at as wealthy developed countries, Taiwan, South Korea, also Singapore and Hong Kong, were countries as poor as India and African countries at the time. these countries have gone from poverty to prosperity in just little over a generation. It's the most stunning sort of advance, and it happened through opening to international commerce, international investment, and access to U.S. and European markets so they could export. And so we have a great success story in this topic. The economic explosion in China since the 1980s has been the greatest advance in the history of mankind of pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So it may sound hugely complicated, all the things we've talked about, but this process is an economic freedom has brought success to this whole part of the world. It's benefited Americans that we have less expensive products than we used to, clothes and manufacturing goods, and it's benefited the Chinese stunningly more. I've written some about this on my blog. The Robert Guest book, Borderless Economics, a few years old now, it's got a section on China, and it's fabulous. So there's lots of exciting books for students to read and articles, and The Economist, of course, is great to read, but it's going to be a great topic. And it won't sound as horribly complicated as I've made it in my conversation.
It's going to be great to see them unpack this. Everyone, Greg Rehmke of economicthinking.org. Till next time, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.